All right, I am moving on to Chapter 13, Dead Horse Alley. Mr. Martin was wrong. There was not one hotel in Nashville that would take in a white man and a colored child. Myrtle realized this a lot sooner than Mr. Martin did. She tried to tell him, but he just got more and more irritable and wouldn't listen. They couldn't even find anywhere to eat lunch. At the first drugstore, they went in and sat down at the lunch counter. The boy at the counter didn't even speak to them. He simply called to the druggist in the back to telephone the police. Myrtle didn't have much trouble getting Mr. Martin out of there. At the next place, the boy behind the counter told them that if they went around to the alley door, he could serve them. Or, he added generously, Mr. Martin could eat at the lunch counter and Myrtle could eat in the alley. Or I can take my business elsewhere, Mr. Martin snapped. Why don't you take it back up north, said the boy, if you don't want to respect our southern customs. After the fourth drugstore, Myrtle suggested that they eat in the alley because she was getting hungry. So that's what they did, sitting on stone steps behind a drugstore, beside an overflowing garbage can, eating egg salad sandwiches and sipping chocolate phosphates. At least prices are cheap in the South, said Mr. Martin, who had paid 20 cents for their lunch. I don't think I like it here, Myrtle repeated. Myrtle's people had lived in Washington ever since the Civil War. Washington wasn't exactly the South, her mother had always said, but it wasn't exactly the North either. Mama had sometimes talked about moving up to the North. She would have been happy that Myrtle ended up in New York. But Myrtle didn't care for the Girls' Training Institute, and she knew Mama wouldn't have cared for it either. Mama had meant for Myrtle to get an education and do something in the world, something besides be somebody's maid. Mr. Martin seemed to get the point about the hotels quicker, perhaps because of their experience at the Tulane. Most of the hotels probably didn't have room anyway, Myrtle thought, because the entire city seemed to be full of visitors wearing yellow or red roses. But the hotels with doormen stopped them at the door, and in those without, the desk clerks shook their heads and said, They have to take us in one of these places, Mr. Martin said as they crossed Capitol Hill and came down on the other side to a row of disreputable-looking hotels and rooming houses, which seemed to be leaning on each other for support. They went into one that said rooms 25 cents over the door. They walked into a gloomy lobby, furnished with weak-backed chairs and a grease-stained sofa that looked like it had fought in the Civil War and lost. Men who seemed to be as much a part of the decor as the tobacco-stained carpet were slumped on the furniture, looking as if they had become one with it. The clerk at the desk sat behind a protective brass cage, in case any of the men in the lobby came to life and attacked. He seemed less affronted than the clerks in the other hotels at the idea that he might have room for Myrtle. Sorry, we don't take colored, he said. We try to run a nice hotel here. Myrtle looked around at the men on the chairs, one of whom was swigging enthusiastically out of a brown bottle labeled Best Stomach Bitters. A cloud of cigarette smoke hovered between their heads and the ceiling. Cigarette butts were scattered around the men's feet. To tell the truth, sir, said the desk clerk, we don't allow ladies here anyways, not even white ones. You can never tell with females, sir, and we do try to keep the place decent. I can see that, said Mr. Martin. Tell me, is it too much to hope that there's anywhere we can lodge in this great city of Nashville? Well, there's a woman down in Crappy Chute that takes in colored, said the desk clerk, thinking. No, come to think of it, I guess she was burned out in the 1916 fire. Now, there's a colored YMCA downtown, but of course they won't take a child. Or you either come to think of it. Now, if you want to send her over to Hell's Half Acre, I'm not sending a 7-year-old girl to a place called Hell's Half Acre, Mr. Martin said. I'm 10, sir, Myrtle reminded him. Oh, that's just the name, the desk clerk shrugged. Smoky Roll's just as bad. Here. He dipped his pen in ink and wrote a name and address on a piece of paper. This woman on Dead Horse Alley rents to colored people. Just head on up 6th Avenue, cross the Louisville and Nashville tracks, and then ask someone else for directions. Mr. Martin took the paper. Thanks. The desk clerk leaned forward against the brass bars of his cage. Listen, young man, he said, dropping his voice so that Myrtle had to strain to hear him. I know what it looks like to you Northerners, the way we do things here in the South, our special customs. But we have a very harmonious relationship between the races down here. Very harmonious. Mr. Martin opened his mouth to answer this, but Myrtle grabbed his arm and led him quickly to the door. They walked up 6th Avenue away from the Capitol. The street was cobbled with gray, brick-shaped stones and had concrete sidewalks that sloped and slouched disconsolately into the street. 2-story brick buildings lined the street, with wooden water towers rising above them here and there. An advertisement painted on one side of a brick building showed 2 colored children of indeterminate sex, both wearing full skirts and nothing else. They had round, white eyes and bright red lips. Between them was a sink full of soap suds, and they were both holding up freshly scrubbed dishes that shone like diamonds, painted rays surrounding the dishes to show how much they were shining. More glowing dishes hung behind them. Beside one child was a box of gold dust cleansing powder. Underneath them were painted the words, "Your servants, ma'am." The sign reminded Myrtle of the Girls' Training Institute, and she felt instantly depressed. "I don't want to ever be anyone's servant," she said. "I agree," said Mr. Martin. "Don't be." "Excuse me, sir." The colored man Mr. Martin called to looked surprised at being called sir. He touched his hat deferentially and gave Mr. Martin directions to the address the desk clerk had written down. Mr. Martin touched his own hat in return. Myrtle thought the 2 men were making each other very uncomfortable. It got worse when they got to Dead Horse Alley. They had run out of brick houses and stone streets by then. There was a smell of outhouses and rotting food on the hot air, and the foul water ran down a gutter at the side of the street. The houses were made of wood, mostly unpainted or painted so long ago that you could no longer tell what color they were supposed to be. "I guess this must be Dead Horse Alley," said Mr. Martin. "According to those directions that fella gave me." He sounded doubtful. Myrtle could see why. It didn't look like an alley. It looked like a dry gully cut by a rushing creek that would be back again the next time it rained. It wasn't even flat. There was no way you could have driven a wagon up it, even if it had been wide enough. I'm going to stop there. We're at the middle of page 159.